are making the news, and as the Scottish Government have now published their proposal to reform the Gender Recognition Act, the team discuss the main issues as they speak to the people for and against the reform in Scotland Tonight.
Tonight, when is a man and a woman? Should the law be changed to make it easier to legally switch?
How you live in society, that's what should matter, not lots of intrusive evidence about your past.
Within the proposals, there are an awful lot of potentially affected groups, specifically women.
Views within communities, political parties, friends and families are wide-ranging and diverse. On Scotland Tonight, we're talking about identity and the legal right to define who you are, man or woman. Some people from within the trans community welcome the proposed reform of the Gender Recognition Act, a set of proposals allowing you to change your sex legally. It strips away the need for medical assessments and is based solely on self-identity. Seems simple? Well, not quite. Not everyone agrees. In fact, the debate has become extremely heated and even toxic at times. Some fear change could compromise women's rights and female-only spaces and have a detrimental effect on young people exploring who they are. Later in the programme, we'll hear from the government minister responsible for leading change. Before that, Ewan Petrie spent time with people from across the divide to get a better understanding of why each side is so firmly entrenched.
I'm one of the people who has applied for a gender recognition certificate, and I found it really offensive and really stressful.
I think the gender reforms they seem really rushed. They seem like they haven't taken into concern the ramifications of it. I think it's really dangerous.
Few measures have provoked the levels of division, anger and abuse as plans to reform the Gender Recognition Act.
This is a much more substantial legal change than the government has described it as, and that it hasn't really done its homework properly.
This is a debate that has polarised opinion, divided political colleagues and split campaign groups.
This will be the death knell of women's spaces.
We don't think it's appropriate that anyone's legal recognition depends on a diagnosis.
The aim of these reforms is to simplify the whole process of changing the legal sex on your birth certificate. Currently you need a formal diagnosis of what's known as gender dysphoria, where you feel distress with your biological sex. You also have to live in your acquired gender for 2 years and provide evidence to a panel, which then decides whether to grant you a gender recognition certificate. These reforms would reduce that time to 6 months and remove the need for a diagnosis, allowing trans people to determine their own personal identity.
I'm one of the people who has applied for a gender recognition certificate, and I found it really offensive and really stressful trying to sort of get that birth certificate changed. And the reason it was so upsetting was that they required me to submit a psychiatric report describing sort of my past and how distressed I'd been about my birth sex, and it just felt really humiliating to have to give that to a panel of strangers. What we're asking for is for it to be closer in alignment to how you change your passport, and not have the same level of intrusive medical evidence and psychiatric reports.
However, the potential to self-identify with no diagnosis is causing serious concern among some who have been through the medical process.
I can't undo what the testosterone has done to me. I can't undo the double mastectomy. I'm only 29. And I need to live with this for the rest of my life.
Sinead Watson transitioned to male in her early 20s. After a few years living as Sean, she realised she had made a mistake and is trying to reverse the process. She fears more people will end up in a similar position, particularly if the age limit is reduced from 18.
There are people that can be so certain in their 20s or in their 30s and still make a mistake. The idea that a 16-year-old can sign the statutory declaration saying that they intend to permanently live as their acquired gender, I mean, They're not old enough to smoke, they're not old enough to drink. I find it really concerning that they would deem a 16-year-old emotionally mature and developed enough to have the foresight to say they're going to identify this way for the rest of their lives. If they're going to remove the need for the medical diagnosis, then anybody will be able to do it. And because I've met so many people whose lives have been completely destroyed by this rush into medical transition, I think the gender reforms they seem really rushed, they seem like they haven't taken into concern the ramifications of it. I think it's really dangerous.
Sivan Hex transitioned more than 10 years ago. She feels the removal of a medical diagnosis robs people of the chance to have any underlying issues addressed.
For me, the medical process was very appropriate. It worked for me, and I don't see that there is anything particularly wrong with it. The original GRA was specifically written for and made for transsexual people, and now that's being carved up to include anyone and everyone. The self-ID isn't even law yet, and yet many of its principles are currently in practice. As transsexuals, with this transgender umbrella over us, we can't escape the criticism. We take that flak too, and our reputation has been damaged and is being damaged by self-ID.
However, campaigners welcome the idea being trans would no longer be considered a condition that needs medical treatment.
Lots of trans people do experience gender dysphoria, but we don't think it's appropriate that anyone's legal recognition depends on a diagnosis. That's just not appropriate. There are many trans young people in Scotland who decide earlier in their childhood to transition socially. We know that those young people will then go on to turn 16, 17, and they're making enormous changes in their lives, meeting new people. They're already at a stage where they have legal rights, where they can vote, they can work. It feels fitting that actually they are then able to be recognised as who they are as they go on to that new stage in their life, and it feels very fitting with the rest of the rights that they already have.
The proposals have caused division within the LGBT community.
There were all these women trying to kind of look for the lesbian kind of...
Last month, the LGBT Alliance launched in Glasgow. They want to pause the legislation to allow more time for discussion over the impact it could have on women-only services and spaces.
The Scottish public think that it's only women who could go into single-sex spaces for women. But it's not. It's already been chipped away by the Scottish Government. This will be the death knell of women's spaces. It'll be the final decision of the Scottish Government to open the doors of all single-sex spaces and allow any man who wants to go in there to do it.
Opponents have branded the Alliance a transphobic hate group. Its founders are former members of Stonewall, who feel the charity no longer speaks for them.
Do you accept, though, that it is causing divisions within the LGBT community?
Stonewall's absolutely committed to this, absolutely committed to trans equality, and we know that the majority of the LGBT community stands with us.
Those battles are not going to be won for progressive values if we see the equality movement fragmented. And we know that there are forces, particularly on the religious right, who see this issue of trans people's rights as a wedge to fragment and split an equality movement which is too strong for them to oppose when we are united.
For Women Scotland is among the organisations who spoke at the launch of the LGBT Alliance. It was formed 2.5 years ago on the back of opposition to the proposals.
We will lose women, well, single-sex spaces, and that's male and female as well. Changing areas, toilets, changing rooms, women-only organisation, girl guides, up to the point of being in prison. We don't know how this is going to work. The bill doesn't truly address what will happen.
People who raise concerns are often labelled transphobic. Are you transphobic for raising these concerns?
No. No. We are not transphobic. We are a women's campaign group. We are pro-women. Trans women have the right to identify as being trans women. They're just not biologically female.
This has also become a highly sensitive political issue. These proposals have caused divisions within the parties, including the SNP, which is pushing forward these reforms. Around 50 of its members set up the Women's Pledge last year to uphold women's rights. It has the support of senior members who are urging the First Minister not to rush ahead.
It's a really profound change because you're expanding the group of people who can change their sex from a small group of people who have this gender dysphoria, which is diagnosed, to a much, much larger group of people who have no medical diagnosis and who could be changing their sex for all sorts of reasons. It's an ideological move, actually. It's not an administrative move. We're just saying that this change in the law, which says that sex is a feeling in your head, is unscientific, wrong and dangerous.
How bad have things got for you?
I've had a lot of abuse online, including from members of my own party, which is upsetting, and I think that we've always, in my party, there's been mutual respect. You have disagreements, you don't air them in public. I've never personally attacked anyone, but I've had a number of personal attacks, and it's deeply upsetting. However, I would say that this is a situation that's affecting other parties as well.
Yes, I can see, there's distinctly certain people within the SNP who are opposed to reforms, and that's their right. I've now started going round local branches. People have an openness to actually try and understand what the issues are. I've obviously had support from within the party as well, so I don't think it's as big an issue within the party as it's painted out to be.
With high levels of anger and division, abuse has been a prominent feature in this debate.
Even just saying something as simple online as, I'm a detransitioner, I've had so many horrible things said to me. And talking about the suicidal thoughts that I'd had in the past, I've had people tell me that I should just go through with it because I'm transphobic and I'm bigoted. And I'll say, well, why do you think that? And I say, because you don't support trans people. I do. I absolutely do, and I think they should have access to transition, they should have access to trans healthcare. I just think that we need more caution, and the idea that that makes me bigoted or makes anyone else bigoted is just, it's horrible, and it's not true.
If the reforms become law, Scotland would follow countries like Argentina, Malta, Canada and Ireland, which have adopted self-identity systems. Changes in England and Wales are being considered.
I think our main concern is that this is a much more substantial legal change than the government has described it as, and that it hasn't really done its homework properly. I don't think I'm here to say that the Gender Recognition Act in its current form is perfect and cannot be reformed and there is no scope. I wouldn't take that view for a minute. We're clearly hearing from people who've been through the current process who find it difficult, and you should always listen to people who are on the receiving end of a public process who make those points. But they've jumped to a particular conclusion and now they're trying to justify it in reverse, and that really is showing in the whole way this is running.
This consultation has removed recommendations included in the original proposals.
Do these reforms go far enough?
The reforms don't go anywhere near as far as trans people were asking, so it's still going to be necessary to have ended up living for at least 6 months in your gender identity before you can change your birth certificate. It's still going to be necessary to be over 16, and there are some young people who have changed their documents with their parental consent at under 16, but that whole question of whether or not it should be allowed for under 16 is being abandoned by the government.
Consensus seems a long way off. The issues raised here are deeply personal. The outcome of the bill could have far-reaching consequences for all those involved.
Shirley-Anne Somerville is the Cabinet Secretary responsible for the reforms. She has told MSPs that the government remains committed to reforming the rules, but she says she wants to build maximum consensus on the issue. Minister, why is this reform to the GRA required?
Well, I think it's very important to listen to the people with lived experience who have been through the current system, and I've spoken to many people in the trans community who have found the process degrading, who talk to me about the severe difficulty they've had with their mental health and the impact that it has. And it's very, very important that we therefore look at what happens in other countries, throughout Europe and further afield, to see whether we can take on that international best practice here.
A significant issue of all of this is self-ID, self-identification. What safeguards will be in place for people taking on a new gender identity?
Well, it's very, very important that we make this process as serious as the process is at this point in time. So what we're looking at is a change in that process, but to absolutely ensure that the people that will be wanting to go through this know that it is still a very serious process that they must undertake to be sure that this is for the rest of their life, and they must be living in their acquired gender, the gender they want to change their birth certificate to, for a period of time before they actually gain that gender recognition certificate.
And that is the safeguard, that somebody has 6 months before they make this decision. Is that the only safeguard that's there?
Well, in the consultation we've suggested that you must be living in your required gender for 3 months, and then we're asking for a period of reflection where that individual will then have to wait and confirm once again that yes, they are still living in that acquired gender and that they do want to follow through and go through that process. Now, as I say, there is a consultation ongoing on these aspects, and I'm very keen to ensure that we do everything we can to allay any concerns that people do have around safeguarding, and that's the proposal that we've put forward, and I do believe that that will ensure that the safeguarding for anyone using this process
So it's entirely down to
there.
the individual, it's not down to, there's no psychological assessment, there's no medical assessment?
What we're trying to do is make sure that we take out the medical assessment process, and again we're looking at the best practice that's happening in other countries. One of the most obvious examples of what's happening in the Republic of Ireland, where they have a scheme reasonably similar to the one that the Scottish Government is proposing, and looking at how that's already worked, again successfully in the Republic of Ireland since its introduction. We see that that's a good example of what can be used in Scotland as well.
But there are examples in Ireland in particular of males who committed sex crimes, who have self-ID'd and are now in women's prisons. That's where the question over safeguarding comes, is it not?
Well, can we deal with the prisons aspect in particular? Because we want to make sure that I absolutely reassure people out there that there is a full risk assessment that takes place now, and that will continue to take place in the future to ensure that any individual is in the prison state that's not just right for them, but right for the other prisoners as well. Nothing on that aspect will change with the proposal that we'll taken through. We'll always take the safeguarding of prisoners, all prisoners, exceptionally seriously.
Anybody who changes their gender has to go through psychological assessment. It's a 2-year process. It's quite rigorous. Under this, they will not have to do that, and they can self-ID, and that may well increase significantly the numbers of people involved, and that in and of itself might then impinge on women's rights.
Well, what we're talking about, again using the examples of what's been seen in other countries, is we estimate around 250 people may go through this process. Now, it's important to recognise that that's a significant step for those individuals, but it is a relatively small number. And the other important aspect I think we do need to bear in mind is what we're talking about, quite rightly from a lot of women's groups, is a fear of men abusing the system, of predatory men abusing the system. Now, I take that very seriously, and the whole of the Scottish Government does. That's why I think we need to make sure that we are representing the trans community and ensuring that we're not saying that trans people are a concern or an issue, but it's predatory men who might misuse a system that are the challenge, and that's why we are determined to keep all the protections that are already in place for women's safe spaces to be absolutely not just be in place, but to be used if those women's organisations deem it appropriate.
Is it transphobic to want to keep male-bodied people out of women's spaces, do you think?
I recognise that there are genuine concerns out there. This is a debate that has created a lot of misunderstandings sometimes, but a lot of genuine questions and concerns out there. And I think it's my responsibility, it's the government's responsibility to try and talk about the facts about what the bill does propose, what it does not propose, and what we are absolutely determined to take into account as we go forward. And the most important thing as I move forward from this is around maintaining and actually extending protection of women as part of this process, as well as the trans community.
Do you believe that biological sex is less important than gender identification?
I don't think this is a matter of priorities. I absolutely appreciate that women's rights are exceptionally important. They have been long fought for and long campaigned on, and there's absolutely nothing I would do as a member of this government to jeopardise any of that. So that's why I really do make sure that I listen to the concerns that are out there on this issue, because we don't want to just protect what we have as women, but we want to make sure our rights are extended.
16 will be able to self-ID, and 16-year-olds can't drink, they can't get a tattoo. Are you comfortable that people that young are sufficiently certain to be able to self-ID?
Well, again, I go back to the young people who I've spoken to who talk about how this is a very, very important part of them recognising as they transition into work, to college, to university, to be able to have that birth certificate as they identify with. What's important is anyone going through that process, no matter their age, but perhaps particularly for young people, that they are supported and given the information that they require as part of that process. That's the important aspect, that people again recognise that this is a very serious undertaking that they will be under, and that they will be able to move forward on that basis.
And you're satisfied that people at the age of 16 who, as I say, can't even get a tattoo, are sufficiently well informed and assured of themselves that they can self-ID?
Well, yes, and again, that's open to the consultation process, but certainly, again, speaking to the young people in the trans community that I have, I do recognise this is an area that they want to actually see us. In fact, they may have wanted us to see the government go further, but I have proposed within the consultation 16 years. But absolutely anyone during this process should be supported to make sure that they're making the right decision for them.
You've said that you want to build maximum consensus on this reform. There's no consensus in your own party, there's no consensus in the Parliament, there's no consensus in feminist groups, and even in the LGBT community. This has become a very polarised debate. How do you get that consensus?
Well, I think what we need to do as a government is to explain very clearly what we are doing, which is about changing the process of how to gain a gender recognition certificate.
But that has been explained, a lot of people are still opposed to it, they just don't agree.
I do, and I still see areas where people have concerns, where we have repeatedly said that the bill will have no effect, for example, on women's safe spaces, on women's refugees and on women's prisons. So
you're saying that, but a lot of groups, a lot of informed people would say it will have. So how do you get that consensus?
Well, I would respectfully disagree that it will have any impact on the Equality Act and on how those exemptions take place.
So that's not consensus?
No, but it's important what I would like to do. I mean, this debate absolutely has generated a lot of heat. There are areas where there is strong oppositions, either because the government's not going far enough or the government's going too far. And what I would ask everyone involved in this debate is to try and make sure that we're carrying on this debate in a respectful fashion, where people are recognising that there are different opinions on this, and work forward to see if there's a way of developing a solution to this. As I say, we need a process in Scotland. We are required to have a process in Scotland about gender recognition. What we want to achieve is a way where I think we are taking away the medicalisation of the current process and the burden that it was creating and the impact that was having on mental health and well-being within the trans community. And we need to find a way of being able to do that, but absolutely along that way be able to reassure women in particular that there is no threat whatsoever to their rights as part of that process.
Is this reform actually going to happen?
Well, I'm absolutely determined that we can move this forward. Again, I've spoken to people in the trans community that tell me the difference it will make. Now, it's very important that we recognise that as a government, as a society, that there are people who, because of the current legislative framework, have an impact on their mental health, have higher suicide rates. We need to take that exceptionally seriously, and we need to be able to ensure that we can develop a policy that ensures that that process is a kinder one to those who have to go through it. Still rigorous, but it can be done in a kind way.
Shirley-Anne, Somerville, thanks for joining us on Scotland Tonight.
Thank you.
The issue of gender recognition might be seen as an issue of our times. It's about identity. Divisions do exist, and the gap may seem far from closing. Will the government be able to reach a consensus in the Scottish Parliament? If not, what then? That's all from Scotland Tonight. We're back on Monday at 10:40. Good night.
Someone knows who she is, and someone knows how she died.